The only thing worse than failing quickly is failing slowly. It's not about dying, it's about ending your startup. The thing that actually dies is you. And the more of your life force you spend on this startup, the less life force you have left for anything else in your life to do later on. So the aim here isn't to just slowly fail, keep this thing going like a zombie for as long as possible before you finally run out of cash. That is not a fucking strategy. That is not a way to live your life. It is not a way to run your startup. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor, hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris.
And I'm Yaniv.
And in this episode, we're going to talk about what to do when you realize you need to cut costs. This is never a fun discussion, but most startups, especially going through a downturn, have to optimize and cut costs. And so if you do it right, this can be an opportunity. And if you do it wrong, it can be pretty disastrous and leave a lasting hole in your business and your momentum. So today's episode, Yaniv, we wanted to talk about how to do it smart and how to do it well, and go through a series of topics around how to do more with less. Just to be clear, our episodes tend to focus on all startups across the spectrum, but I think when you're talking about cost cutting, it really assumes you have quite a bit of costs to cut and that you are probably at a medium to large startup, right? So you have 4, 5, 7, 10 people, maybe heading into 50, 100, 200 people, right? If you're in a tiny little startup, you probably don't have too many things you can shave off. So most of our comments today are probably in the context of a startup with a few people, a little bit of money, and they're burning capital.
So, Chris, I guess I always like to start a bit with first principles, and this is not quite in our run sheet, but I guess a good question you should ask yourself when executing a cost-cutting measure is, what does a good outcome look like for you? Obviously, the main outcome you want here is that your burn rate drops, but what is the difference in outcome between good cost-cutting and bad cost-cutting?
You want to be able to cut cost without crippling your momentum. And I literally see founders talk about, hey, I don't know what we're going to do, but we just need to extend the runway. We just need to extend the runway and raise a bridge round. And I'm like, a bridge to where? What is it that you're trying to get to? The answer to this question is really in the first item in our run sheet here, Yaniv, which is strategy. You have to figure out, what does the company look like after the cost cutting? And what is at the very, very core of what you're trying to do?
Going back to the same sort of thing we always say, with venture-backed startups, you're a growth story, right? You are trying to learn how to become a really big company that makes a lot of money at some point in the future. So if you don't know how to learn and grow, then again, like you said, you extend the runway, but if you don't take flight by the end of the runway, all you've done is waste more of your time. The only thing worse than failing quickly is failing slowly. And so you can't cut your startup in a way that is just no longer viable for it to have a high growth story, because then all you've got is a slow growing, unprofitable business that is kind of bleeding out. You need to keep your momentum. If you cripple your momentum and put yourself in a situation where you have no viable path to growth, then you're just prolonging the inevitable. And honestly, you're better off at that point not cutting costs and having one last swing for the fences, or just giving your investors their money back, because nobody wants you to take that path. It really comes down to doing more with less, working smarter, not harder, using whatever cliche you like, right? And that, Chris, is what brings us to strategy, which is to say, okay, given that we're now going to have less resources going forward, what is our strategy going to be? How do we adapt our strategy to that reality so we still have the best possible opportunity of having a high momentum, high growth story, and therefore being able to build that Silicon Valley style startup?
The mistake I often find in my advisory work is that strategy is treated as this exercise in organizing the chaos, labeling and categorizing and putting everything into neat boxes and saying, oh, here's these kind of customers and these kind of customers and these kind of customers. And this product effort and that product effort and that product effort. Let's put them into neat little groups and let's label them and satisfy our OCD. And as an offsite with all the executives and they all contribute their thinking and what they see from their part of the world, you come up with this beautiful, neat mapping of everything that's going on. But that's not strategy. That's categorization.
Mm,
Strategy is looking at all of the opportunities for your business in front of you and deciding, of all of that potentiality, which reality do we want to pursue? Which course, which pathway through that opportunity do we want to take? And
mm,
it is likely to be embarrassingly narrow. It's likely to be uncomfortable. It's likely to feel like you are closing doors of opportunity, which might seem crazy. Like, why would we cut ourselves off from this good opportunity? A good strategy should feel like that, should feel uncomfortable, embarrassing, and like you are leaving opportunity on the table. Only then should you look at the next layer down and figure out what are the projects, the departments, the people, the org structure that we need within that context, within that strategy. And the last point I'll make about this is, in order to do that, you need to make a bet. You need
mm.
to form some kind of conviction based on limited data. And you need to understand that you can't do everything at the same time. That whatever you choose is not necessarily saying no to everything else. It's saying not now. We're going to
Mm.
do one thing well and eventually, in months or years, earn the right and build the business that is capable of supporting these other ideas.
That's right. As you were talking, Chris, a new metaphor or analogy jumped into my mind. So let's try this one out. Why does a knife cut? The reason a knife cuts is because it is very thin at the edge. So the amount of contact it makes with the thing that it's cutting is very small. And so when you put pressure on that knife, all of that pressure is concentrated into that very small area. So the application of that pressure on a small area means it's actually an immense force. And that's what allows you to slice through quite hard objects with relatively modest amount of force. Now, what's the analogy here? When you cut costs, that effectively means you have less pressure you're able to put to bear on the knife. So if you want to be able to cut through, you need to make the knife even sharper. That is what this strategy is saying. Cost cutting means sharpening your focus, sharpening your strategy, and making sure that you still have enough of that pressure at the edge that you can cut through. Otherwise, you've got a somewhat blunt knife and you don't have enough muscle to do the cutting. What you're going to end up with is expending that effort for no result because there simply isn't that sharpness.
Yeah, it's a beautiful metaphor. You know, the cliche metaphor in Silicon Valley vocabulary is the thin wedge in the world, which is a fancy way of saying a knife, right? It's a thin wedge that you shove into the world. You kind of crack the world open and make a place for yourself. And then you expand the wedge into adjacencies over time. And the mistake people make very, very often is they go, well, shit, if we don't have all of this other stuff, we're somehow not credible. We're somehow not solving all the problems. We have all of these other customers saying these other things are opportunities. Yes, they are opportunities, but they're opportunities for later. And so, as
Mm.
Yaniv says, you need to sharpen that wedge, sharpen that knife, and insert yourself into the world. And then you can crack it open over time. And as you also said, Yaniv, this is necessary for any good startup at any time, but it is mandatory and existential when you're in the middle of a downturn, you have capital scarcity, and you need to cut costs. You can't just dial the volume down on everything you're doing. You have to cut a lot of what you're doing and double down on the things that are working and the things that are part of that thin edge, that thin wedge in the world.
There's also this term peanut buttering to completely switch metaphors, right? Where there's this idea of you imagine your resource, in this case, it might be your runway, is a bunch of peanut butter, right? And so you sort of spread it across all the bread. And the less peanut butter you have, the more thinly you spread it, right? So imagine, what this cost reduction means is like, oh, okay, we have less peanut butter than we thought we did. Do we try to equally spread it across the whole piece of bread? In which case, it just kind of tastes crap. Or do we say, let's cut the piece of bread in half and then use that peanut butter wisely? So sorry, I know I'm in metaphor overload here, but I think the point here, well, there are actually 2 points. One is that the strategy needs to change, right? You need to revisit your strategy. You can't just say, oh, we're going to use the same strategy with less peanut butter. We're just going to spread it all across all the things we're doing. And now none of them have the power to actually succeed. And the other thing, Chris, that you said, which I think is really powerful, is this is an exercise you should probably go through, even if you have plenty of runway, even if you're in the fortunate position of not needing to cut costs, because that discipline of thinking, how can we do more with less? How can we have a sharper strategy? It's never a bad time to have a sharper knife. And so this is something that I think is really worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, most of the companies that contact me with a product problem have a business strategy problem. And most of the companies that contact me with a engineering problem have a product problem. And so if you think about it like a pyramid, right? It's business, product, and engineering. Most of them that come to me with engineering have a product problem, and most of the product problems are a business strategy problem. And so I have to take them all the way to the top and say, what are we going to say no to, and how do we sharpen that knife? When you don't have experienced product managers and product leaders around, they are trying to digest the chaos from the business level rather than mitigating and reshaping that chaos, going to the executive team and saying, you are giving me too diffuse a business strategy. And so senior product leadership, which I'm often acting as, is going back to the CEO, COO, CRO, CMO and saying, no, boys and girls, this is wrong up here. Before I even touch the product strategy, we need to rethink the business strategy.
We talked about saying no, making a bet, having conviction, and sequencing effectively. And I actually just wanted to quickly dive in on sequencing because I think this is one of the things that you see being done wrong the most, and then something that becomes even more critical with cost cutting. And one way you can think of sequencing here is as much as possible, you should be single threaded. Instead of doing things in parallel, you should be doing one thing at a time.
I want to stress this. The entire company should be doing that same thing. Meaning, I'll often meet founders and companies where the marketing team is off testing some other different thing, and the sales team is selling something else, and the product team is working on something else. And so the strategy and the planning cycle needs to be we're doing this one thing, breaking into this one market, or doing this one rotation, and marketing is testing the market, and sales is talking to enterprise customers, and ops is gearing up for the rollout, and product is building the thing. Everyone should be doing that one thing. There might be a little bit of checkerboarding, but otherwise, generally speaking, everyone should be oriented around that one thing.
There are exceptions, absolutely. And, I think sometimes what you say is, okay, we've got one thing and we're dependent on external factors that slow us down. And so we've got idle time, right? So you parallelize to the extent that you're always busy working on important things. But you should start with the assumption that that should be as few things as possible. And the fewest, obviously, is one. So start with, can we put all of our focus on this one thing? No, because we have an external partner or whatever we need to wait for, or as a vendor, there's something in the critical path that just one engineer needs to work on. Sure, make use of your time efficiently, but don't start with the assumption that we've got 5 things to do. So let's start all 5 of them now. The best way to pull results forward is to do thing 1, then thing 2, then thing 3, then thing 4, then thing 5. And not only that, by the time you've done thing 1, you've probably learned some things. That means that when you do thing 2, you do it better, or you realize that thing 2 wasn't the right thing after all. So you absolutely optimize for learning by doing things in serial rather than in parallel.
Okay, so now on to the next subject, which is org structure. So as I touched on, once you've figured out the strategy, this embarrassing thin strategy that is very, very focused and leaving a lot of other opportunities on the table, everything else falls from that. And very likely the next thing that you need to figure out is your org structure. Because if people are in this kind of confused mess and not really sure how to relate to each other and what team they're on and what they're working on, then you're just going to have a lot of inefficiency and waste in the system. And so the second place to look for cost savings is in your org design. How should the teams be organized? What should their missions be? How should people be relating to each other? And where is their inefficiency and waste hidden in that structure? And how does that structure need to change given that we have now a new, more efficient, more focused strategy? So the next thing to take a look at when you're trying to squeeze out cost is the way the company is structured and the kind and arrangement of the roles to orchestrate this strategy that you've just refined.
So we haven't said layoffs yet, Chris, and I know it's further down our run sheet, but I guess the point here is because we're talking about cost reduction, but this is nearly step by step. This is the right order in which to think about it. Ultimately, changing your org structure doesn't cut costs, but what it might allow you to do is figure out what organizational structure and what people you need to execute the strategy you've just defined. And then that gives you the opportunity to execute layoffs so that hopefully your new org structure, or not hopefully, what you need to be doing is designing a new org structure that is smaller than your old org structure. Otherwise, you haven't actually created the opportunity to cut costs.
Well, I want to push back on that slightly, Yaniv, which is to say, I think a better org structure, better aligned against your new strategy, will in itself drive efficiencies, which will, in subtle and obvious ways, actually reduce your costs. Oftentimes, people don't value opportunity cost, but they also don't value execution delay as a form of cost. And it's like you have these fixed outgoing costs. And if it takes them 2 months to do something because of the way they're organized, and the way they're tripping over each other, and instead they should take them only 1 month, that is a month of cost that you have spent. And I think a good org structure with some of the other things we're about to talk about, like alignment and so on, will suck out subtle but important costs from your business.
So I think, like, obviously, one way of thinking about cost reduction is saying, how can we take our existing money in the bank and get the best use out of it? But I think when people talk about cost reduction, they're really talking about cash flow. They're talking about burn reduction. They're saying, how can we spend less money this month? Not how can we accelerate to a better outcome? Obviously, the answer is both. But I think accelerating to a better outcome is something you should always be doing. I don't believe that is a cost-cutting thing as such. So while I don't disagree with you, I do think that most startups, their two biggest costs, and I want to talk about both of these, are people and paid marketing. And it is very difficult to execute significant cost cutting without reducing your headcount. Now, it's not a pleasant thing to talk about or think about, but generally, if you try to avoid letting anyone go, you are not going to be able to execute a meaningful cost reduction. And therefore, I do think that in this context, when we're talking about cost cutting, and we want to optimize our org structure to our strategy, we want to have an org structure that is smaller at the end than what we currently have.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're only thinking about cost cutting as reducing the number at the bottom of the month, you're missing a trick. I agree with most of what you said, which is that the biggest input is staff. If you're really going to impact your monthly burn, you're going to need to probably cut costs, and you should do that in alignment with your new org structure, which is in alignment of your product strategy. All accepted, understood, and obvious, right? But I do think if you are not thinking about the efficiency of your execution towards an outcome as a startup, you're missing a trick. Because the point is not just to extend the runway. The point is to have a runway that gets you to an investable outcome. If you don't get to that investable outcome in a short enough period of time, all of that cost cutting is for nothing. And so ideally, you want to get there as fast as possible so you have the maximum time to raise the next round in a comfortable position. And so I do think while the most obvious, the most emotionally satisfying, the most direct thing you should be thinking about is cutting your monthly burn, I think you should also be cutting the amount of months you burn in order to do something well. And that I think both of those go hand in hand.
You know what? You're absolutely right. Let's talk theoretically. Theoretically, what you have is a bunch of money, perhaps that you've raised, or a bunch of money that you're able to spend on your startup, and you want to get to your next milestone before you run out of money. The next milestone can be profitability, it can be your next capital raise, whatever it is, right? But you need to get to the next thing that allows you to fund the next phase of your company before you run out of money. And in theory, if you could blow all that money in 1 month, if you could spend it all in 1 month, but the result at the end of that month is a higher likelihood of being able to move to the next stage than slowly trickling it out over 12 months, then that is the rational thing to do. 100% agree.
Yeah, you've nailed it. That's an even sharper way of saying what I'm saying, because during the downturn, I've just seen so many founders cutting the wrong things to extend the runway. They still have a lot of burn, which is going to take them to nowhere, a runway to nowhere. So instead of dying in 5-6 months, they're going to die in 12 or 24 months, having not achieved the thing they want to achieve or need to achieve to raise the next round.
Yeah, it's funny you use the word die. I actually want to go back. This is maybe a little bit an aside, but I think it's relevant in this context, Chris, which is, I quickly said in passing, the only thing worse than failing quickly is failing slowly. And the point is, it's not about dying. It's about ending your startup. The thing that actually dies is you. And the more of your life force you spend on this startup, the less life force you have left for anything else in your life to do later on. So the aim here isn't to just slowly fail, keep this thing going like a zombie for as long as possible before you finally run out of cash, having a sort of just blind hope. Like we've talked about the fact that startup founders, they need to be optimists, but they need to be realists, right? Just kind of hanging in there and hoping that a miracle will come. That is not a fucking strategy. That is not a way to live your life. It is not a way to run your startup. So do not look to just cut burn. Right? Even getting to cash flow break even, if it kills all your growth and you're venture funded, you're screwed, right? Because no one is going to invest in again, that's just a shitty business. It's a business that generates no money, but has investors that expect massive growth. You're in a lot of trouble. So you need to understand the game you're playing, understand that you're in a risk on game. If you want to do a Silicon Valley style startup, it is risky. The probability of failure is high. Given that, all other things being equal, you would rather fail quickly than fail slowly. So then you can take your next bet or move on to the next thing in your life. It doesn't have to be another startup.
Yeah, that's right. And that's really the big point I wanted to make in today's episode. It's not like how to fire people. It's how to think about your costs holistically so that you can optimize them using a kind of a 360-degree understanding of your business while still maintaining a trajectory to high growth Silicon Valley style outcomes. It's that splitting the difference. It's that holding those two ideas in your mind at the same time that I'm not seeing in my advisory work. I'm not seeing people maintaining both requirements. They're reducing the costs, but not maintaining their trajectory to a Silicon Valley outcome. And that's the concern that I have for a lot of founders.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
So on that, Yaniv, and related to this, the next kind of efficiency gain that you need to think about is alignment. You've got now a better strategy, you've got a better org structure, you now know who you actually need on the boat. You now need to think about how do those people align and work on the right things. Because another hidden cost that is turning 1 month of execution into 2 or 3 months of execution is when the marketing team is distracted over in this direction and the product team is distracted over that direction. And we've had a whole episode or 2 episodes about the idea of traction requiring alignment. If you haven't listened to an episode about alignment, please do. I do think it's one of our most important episodes. And so we shouldn't belabor the point in this one, but you need to go listen to that episode and do all of those things to make sure that the remaining people in the remaining org chart are well aligned, working on that strategy and only on that strategy in as efficient a way as possible.
I mean, in a way, what we're saying here is step one that we talked about is having a clear strategy, sharpening that knife. And then alignment is making sure that everyone's pushing down on that knife and not like moving in other directions, right? So the less resource you have, when I say resource, I'm talking about money, people, time, the more focused and the more aligned you need to be because you just simply cannot afford waste. And a lack of alignment is directly waste. It is a waste of effort. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. So you need to get better. Here's the interesting thing, Chris. Quite often when I see companies that are cutting costs, that is because they're under stress, right? Remember, we're all human. These companies are under stress. The people in those companies are under stress. And what can happen when you're stressed and when you're like, okay, what needs to be successful here is the business is a lot of the softer stuff. I hate the term softer because it makes it sound unimportant, right? The softer stuff goes out the window. The stuff like making sure we get together as a team and talk about our strategy and get aligned. It's like, all right, no, we're too busy executing. We're too busy executing for that stuff. But what happens then is if you get sort of myopic on execution and forget to align the team, then, you're very busy, but you're not very productive. And so it is hard because you can feel like, we just got to put our nose to the grindstone. But if you're a leader in a company like that, this sort of time, this sort of pressure, this sort of stress, it's the time to double down on having a healthy organization. And alignment is a key part of a healthy organization. So it's quite counterintuitive or it's counter to a lot of people's natures, but it's really important to do that.
Absolutely. Okay, the next important thing here is, and you'll notice, we're leaving firing people to the end. So I want to, the audience is like waiting for like, hey,
burying the lead.
People, right?
It's like, the tension is
when are we
killing
firing
me.
people?
When are we firing people? Oh my God.
But the next thing on the list here is hire smarter, better people. Similar to the idea that your org should be better designed and your alignment should be better maintained so that you can do things in 1 month that might have historically taken you 2 or 3 months. The same is true down to the granularity of a person. And there are some people who can do in 6 hours what takes others 6 days. And some people can do things in 6 days that takes others 6 weeks or 6 months. And I've seen this viscerally across my portfolio of startups. And often, actually, I frame what I do as an advisor as, hey, I try to make things that take 6 months, take 6 weeks, and things that take 6 weeks to take 6 days. That's actually the core of how I think about my business model. And you need to think about this for every one of your key people. Because I have seen teams that are executing a project or a product or a rotation that have literally taken 6 months to do something that I have worked with another company and seen them do it in 6 days. I'm not exaggerating. It is that black or white. And in some cases, the team that did it in 6 days did it better. The very best people are not just a little bit better. They're exponentially better. And their contribution is not just a little bit more. It's exponentially more. The best thinkers and strategists are the ones helping you with your alignment, with your org structure, with your strategy, with your day-to-day decision making, so that every day, every hour, every minute that passes, you're doing more with less. So be careful when you are eventually going to fire people, and we're going to get to that, where you're looking at the org chart just for the most expensive people and contractors and going, well, we don't need to burn that, we don't need to burn that, we don't need to burn that. But well, those three people might be the ones that are actually helping you spend the money and the time most effectively. And so again, to this idea, Yaniv, of efficient execution is just as important as how much spend you're making every month. This is just one of the most important things. Hire better people, even if they might be more expensive. That's the most counterintuitive part of this. And they might help you execute more quickly and even replace 2 or 3 or 4 other people on the team.
Just to color in a couple of those things, you're very right to link it to your point about efficient execution. When we're looking at letting people go at layoffs, the problem is often using the wrong units of accounting, right? There's two ways this could go wrong. One is we say, okay, how much do people earn, right? Like what's the salary? And let's let go of expensive people. Even worse, what you see sometimes is it's done in terms of headcount, where like someone who's earning, $50,000 per annum and someone who's earning $200,000, it's like, we just need to cut 5 headcount. Both of those things are wrong. And again, it comes down to maybe the right way of thinking about it is whether we're talking about our cash and bank, our runway, or whether we're talking about our employees, is like how much value do we get per dollar that we pay them? That's actually a sort of a rate rather than an absolute thing. And of course, there's more complexity to it than this. And I would also say it's important to consider this value in the context of an overall organization. You might have 2 people who are each 10x's, but if they do the same thing and you only need one person to do that thing, you don't want to keep them both, of course. And there are more subtle versions of that. But in general, yes, good people, they might cost 50% more and be 1,000% more productive. Like, you do the maths on that. Those are the people that you want. Even more, my final point on this, Chris, if you have better people, you can have fewer people. And fewer people means less organizational overhead. All other things being equal,
Yes.
a 10-person organization is going to run more efficiently than a 20-person organization. And that's because there's less overhead in keeping people aligned in communication and coordination. Instead, you can spend more time on execution. So you actually want to minimize the number of people you have and maximize the productivity of each of those people.
Yeah, just a final point on this. One of the compliments I've received in my career that I take most to heart, that I'm most proud of,
You have nice
is
eyes, beautiful eyes,
that I have nice,
No?
I have nice eyes. I have a number of investors, venture capitalists that introduced me to their startup portfolio to help de-risk the portfolio. And one of them introduced me to one of their founders. And the founder came back to the partner and said, wow, he's really expensive. And he said, yes, but it's more expensive not to have him. And I was like, he later relayed that to me. And I was like, wow, thanks so much for that, Danny. That's the point that we're trying to make is be careful of getting rid of people who might be expensive or who might be part of the headcount who are more expensive to get rid of because they're making the machine run. They're accelerating your decision making. They're getting things done. And that's really, really important. All right, now we get on to probably, Yaniv, the red meat of the episode, right? We've deliberately put this towards the end because what we're trying to say is there's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to do first, and then you get to the part where everyone jumps to, which is we need to fire people. And so this is the next cost reduction strategy that we want to talk about. We're going to ultimately need to fire people, right? That's often the case.
Yeah, Patty McCord said she doesn't like the word firing people because it sounds very personal. And, I don't want to be too, careful with my language, but I generally agree, right? This is not these people's fault. This is simply about cost reduction. So these are layoffs, right? We're just no longer able to justify paying them. And yes, here's the thing, right? In most tech startups, and maybe if you're in hardware or something else, like some sort of more exotic space, this is different. But in nearly every sort of software-focused tech startup, your number 1 cost is people. Your number 2 cost is marketing. You cannot significantly cut your costs if you keep that people line static. And so you're going to need to go there and you're going to need to figure out how do you let people go. Now, this episode is not the tactical piece. This is not the what's the right thing to say to people and how do you treat people generously and kindly and so on. This is about how to make the decisions about who to let go and when to do it. And so, again, we've presented this episode in a kind of sequence, in a particular order, right? So if we have a strategy, and we have smarter, better people, if we have an org structure mapped out that allows us to execute on that strategy, as long as everyone's aligned to that strategy, then that was a little argument you and I were having before, Chris. The target org structure that we have for this new strategy should probably be smaller in terms of cost. And again, not in terms of headcount, but should cost you less than the org structure you currently have. And so then executing the layoffs becomes nearly, you've done all the work already. You basically find the people in the organization who do not have a place in your new organizational structure, and you let them go. It's actually pretty simple from the decisioning point of view. So that's the interesting thing. If you actually think about how we've mapped this out, I don't think we did this deliberately, but It's
No,
actually true.
I did. I did.
Oh, Chris. Okay. So Chris had a master plan. I'm just the chump who goes along for the ride. But what we see here is you don't start by saying, oh, we're going to do layoffs. Who should we lay off? No, you start with what does life look like after our cost reduction? Like, what is our strategy? How do we make sure that we're well equipped to execute that strategy? And so then the layoff decision kind of nearly makes itself, right? It is the diff between what you have now and what you've said you will need to have going forward in this new world. And so again, this is not a tactical episode. Executing a layoff well and compassionately is another episode, and perhaps we'll get to that. But in terms of making the decision, it should be pretty straightforward.
And now the last category of really obvious ways you can reduce your spend and optimize what you're doing is marketing spend.
Like I said before, marketing spend at a lot of startups is often the second biggest line item in the budget. And it definitely feels easier to cut than people. Emotionally, it's a lot easier to cut than people. Practically, it is also easier to cut than people because it's usually just a question of dialing down your budget in Facebook or in Google or lowering your agency retainer, whatever it is. And so it's very tempting. And it is often the right thing to do to cut your marketing spend. But just hold up a moment. And as with people, you want to think about not just how do we cut the burn, but what do we do with our marketing spend such that we're making the best use of our money and maximizing our probability of getting to that next stage as a venture-backed startup? Again, venture-backed startups are about growth. If you cut your marketing to zero and your growth goes close to zero, then you're probably just marking time. Now, there are times when it is the right thing to do, but I think our point here all along, Chris, is like start with the outcome. Use your first principles thinking. If what you're saying is, oh, okay, we don't have great product market fit, therefore our marketing is too expensive, our customer acquisition costs are too high, our retention is too low, our LTVs are too low, and therefore what we really need to do is rebuild our product, retool, and then go back to market. Well, then there's probably not much point spending your precious cash funneling customers to a product that's not really working. Then you should probably cut your marketing spend to zero, rebuild, and then execute whatever changes you need to make, and then ramp back up. So that's one cost-cutting scenario. But another cost-cutting scenario is simply, okay, you have less money than you would like. You have something that's working reasonably well, but maybe you've just gotten a bit sloppy with your marketing, right? You've focused on growth at the expense of efficiency, and so you're probably spending too much on your budgets. You're still putting money into channels that don't work and so on. And then what I think the right thing to do is to say, okay, let's focus on efficient growth. And efficient growth, again, we've got episodes on this and lots of other podcasts have episodes about things like CAC, LTV, these sorts of marketing funnel metrics. But really what you want to do is have a target of saying, okay, what does efficient growth look like to us? What is an acceptable customer acquisition cost for us? And we will cut down our marketing to a defensible level where we're only investing in those channels that meet our standard for that metric, right? So instead of saying, okay, we can put more money in and it gives us a bit more growth, but it's not efficient, you focus only on efficient growth. And I think that's the difference. And again, another overarching theme of this whole episode, Chris, is this is the sort of stuff you should probably be doing anyway. It's a pretty good thought exercise whether or not you're running out of money to pretend you're running out of money and ask yourself what costs you would cut. There's a concept called blitzscaling. It was popularized by Reid Hoffman. It's not that popular right now because blitzscaling is something you do when you have a lot of money and not a lot of time, when the opportunity cost is extremely high and you pursue growth at all costs. Not many companies are pursuing growth at all costs right now. So when you are doing your marketing, especially your paid marketing, bring efficiency into the equation. If you can hit your efficiency targets, then you should probably keep spending because you would rather grow 100% this month than like 50% this month and 50% next month if you had your choice. You would rather bring that growth forward. So there's no point just cutting your marketing spend to close to zero because you want to extend your runway, unless you have a good thing that you want to do with that extra runway, like rebuild your product.
Yeah, that's right, Yaniv. And I think efficiency is the key word for the entire episode, right? And
Yep.
so to summarize, what you want is a more focused, efficient strategy. You want a minimum viable org structure to support that strategy. You want minimal distractions with maximum alignment. You want to hire more efficient, high impact people. You want to fire the people who don't fit the org or that impact criteria. And you want to retool your marketing towards the most efficient tactics. And really, those things combined, and I'm sure there are some others, are the ones that are going to have the most impact on your burn and allow you to do more with less. And it's a little bit of a counterintuitive point there, which is to say, people think if their strategy is broad and diverse and they're working on a lot of things, they're doing more. And what we're trying to say is by doing things in the right order, with efficiency and effectiveness, you will end up doing more, even though it feels like in the moment you're doing less. And so that's the ultimate answer to doing more with less, is more focus and more effective people and more efficiency.
So we had a bit of a bait and switch this episode, Chris. We started out talking about cutting costs, but really we talked about efficiency, and that is not an accident, right? Because cutting costs is not quite the right way of thinking about it. Cutting costs means cutting inefficient spend so that every dollar you have goes as far as possible towards helping you meet your Silicon Valley style goals. So start with efficiency, and naturally those cost reduction opportunities will come to you. So folks, cutting costs is about increasing efficiency. So Chris, like you said, you're not that cheap, but the amount of efficiency that you can drive in an organization is epic. And so don't be penny wise and pound foolish, folks. If you need to improve your efficiency, you need help with that, you need Chris. Chris, how can people work with you?
Yeah, that's right, Yaniv. I'd like to think that I'm one of those 10x contributors, but who can also help you 10x improve your efficiency. So that's a 100x outcome. So yes, if you want to learn more about my advisory work, feel free to check out chrissaad.com/advisory and subscribe to my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter.
Absolutely.
All right, Yaniv, been another fun one as always. As we were talking, I just saw one of our listeners post on LinkedIn saying, this podcast is gold. Chris and Yaniv deliver so many facts episode after episode. And this has just happened completely organically as we were talking. And so, yes, if you are listening to the show and you're getting even just a little bit of value, we ask you to please honor the implicit startup podcast pact that you have signed, which is to share us on your favorite social media network, like Mandar has here, I just found, and subscribe to us in your favorite podcasting app, rate us and review us, tell your friends. It helps us grow the show and ultimately help more founders succeed.
Okay, thanks, Chris. It was a good one as always.
Catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.